Joining us from the great state of Georgia is Congressman Austin Scott. Congressman, great to have you on today.
Hey, thanks for having us, John.
You were on a few weeks ago as the Ukraine-Russia conflict was just beginning, and you said something that a lot of people weren't saying. Now everybody sees it. We are on the cusp of not only a global crisis, a food crisis. We were going to have problems with fertilizer, food. You have some new developments on that, some reports that Russia is going to be cutting off seed, which could really affect the world. Talk a little bit about how Russia's domino effect is going to affect us later this year.
Yeah, so for the most part, when we think about sunflowers in the U.S., maybe we buy a little sunflower oil. Maybe when we're filling up with $4 a gallon gas, now we buy a small bag of sunflower seed
right?
to eat. But what people need to know is that across the world, sunflower and sunflower oil is a big food item for the majority of the people. And what Russia has recently done is a step even further away from the norms, in that they are now issuing a ban on sunflower seed and rapeseed export, which oil also comes from rapeseed. And so they're actually issuing a ban on the seed supply for the world,
wow.
not just the actual oil or the commodity that comes from it. And so, again, just very dangerous territory, John, that we have not seen. They, in recent history, they are number one supplier of nitrogen in the world.
Right.
They and Belarus are number two and number three in potash. And the thing that America's got to learn from this, and the rest of the world's got to learn from this, is we cannot allow ourselves to become dependent on countries that do not share our interests or our values in anything, whether it be energy or whether it be food or whether it be pharmaceuticals or our economy. And, it doesn't mean that you can't have some trade back and forth, but there's a difference in trade that you're able to get a square deal on and dependence.
Yeah, and we got sleepy at that both with China and Russia. There are lots of places I don't think Americans know that we have a enormous interdependence with Russia. We saw it with the oil and gas, and we had to scramble to try to make up that 2 or 3% of our energy supply. 20% or 1/5 of all uranium that powers our nuclear reactors comes from Russia now because of some deals that the Biden-Obama administration made back in the early 2010, 2015 period. But there's another one that I know you focus on because it involves our ability to get satellites and to control space. Rocket engines. Talk a little bit about why that puts America at such a disadvantage right now.
Yeah, so for years we had because of bad policy inside the U.S., become dependent on Russians' rocket engines to launch the satellites that we're dependent on into space. And so fortunately, because of the private sector stepping in now, we're not nearly as dependent on those rockets from Russia. But again, because of bad policy that says you can't mine, you can't manufacture, you can't do all of these things inside of the United States, or the cost of the bad rules and regulations of manufacturing those items inside the United States, we literally had become dependent on Russia for rocket engines to launch the satellites. And so fortunately there's the private sector and capitalism saving America and the world again, that has come about. And now you see Musk and others who are these great entrepreneurs that have provided an avenue that allows us to launch satellites without having to have the Russian rockets. But just again, John, it's an area where, because of bad policy, we in the United States had become dependent on a country that does not share our interests or our values.
Yeah, it is remarkable. And, funny, I was down in Georgia shortly after I interviewed last time, and someone came up, they had heard the interview and said, Congress he's got so much common sense. Common sense is what we want in our political leaders. You look at the Biden administration, after all of the awakening that occurred from the Russia conflict, that, oh my God, we have these interdependencies, we've given Putin geopolitical advantage over us. His response to it isn't to ramp up our own energy supply or to turn to Canada. It's all right, let's dump out the emergency reserves we have, and maybe we can get some oil from Venezuela and Iran. Almost going back to the failed playbook of let's go to our enemies and not use our internal strengths to win this supply battle. Do you think there's a moment where Congress wakes up in a big way and says, listen, we're too dependent on China, too dependent on Venezuela, too dependent on Russia, we're going to insource, create a manufacturing renaissance, an energy renaissance like we had under President Trump. Do you think Congress is ready for that moment?
I think America is ready for that moment, and I think that in November the Americans are going to go to the polls, and I think they're going to vote for that moment to happen. And then the question is, will the current team in the White House actually accept that moment? And so if you look back at what happened in the last election, I mean, nobody thought President Trump had a chance, right?
Yeah.
Did not have a chance, and yet Democrats, Republicans, and Independents went to the polls and voted for him, and because he was talking about American innovation, American jobs, American ingenuity, and look how much progress we were making during the first 2 years of his administration, and then COVID hits, and we take this huge step back. But that America is still there, and so I think that America goes to the polls in November. I think they vote overwhelmingly for Republicans to take the House and the Senate, and then we will have to, John, use the appropriation measures to force the Biden administration to undo their bad policy and accept good policy that we'll hopefully be able to put in. We will be able to put in to the appropriation riders. So I believe in this country. I think the vast majority of Americans believe in this country, and you know, November's coming, and we're going to fix some of this stuff. With regard to the oil and tapping the reserves, if I'm cutting the grass and my main tank goes empty and I turn the switch to the reserve tank, it means I better be looking for somewhere else, right? To get my fuel for some more fuel, I should say. I want to get that fuel from someone who's a friend of mine, and we can produce it right here in America. I mean, all he's got to do is undo his anti-energy policies, and yet he refuses to do it. And so in a way, he's making it worse, because if you tap the reserve today, that means that reserve won't be there tomorrow. And who knows what's going to happen across the world with the current war that's going on.
That's it. We're literally making a very risky bet. This is a game of Russian roulette, no pun intended.
No pun intended,
yeah,
right.
Because, this is supposed to be there for times of war or huge crisis. And
that's right.
We're doing it for convenience because we cut off our own energy supply. And I just keep scratching my head saying, where's the common sense? I think we found it when we talked to you. That's the good news.
Yeah, when you burn through the reserves, you don't have the reserves, right?
Yeah.
And so whether it's a storm or a war, and we are in a war right now,
That's
I
right.
think everybody realizes that.
Yep. Yeah, no, so true in many ways. Do you see this as a mandate election? You know, they don't come around very often. 1980 was a mandate election. Is this a mandate election where America speaks with such clarity that the agenda and the silliness of Washington really gets pushed back in a way that only can happen maybe once in a generation?
I think so. I mean, it happened in 2010. The Democrats kept doubling down on their agenda
That's
at the
right.
stage, and we won an unprecedented number of seats in 2010. I think that the same thing happens here in November. That's obviously up to the voters, but the Democrats keep doubling down on their anti-American, anti-energy, anti-food policies. And John, if you're getting up in the morning and going to work, your pay raises are not offsetting the increased cost of living in this country.
You're running backwards right now. Yeah.
If you're retired and living off your Social Security or your retirement plan, you're not even getting the wage increases. And so, I mean, if you look at what the cost of basic necessities have done just in the last 18 months since President Biden has been, not even 18 months since he's been sworn into office, there's a tremendous amount of damage that's been done to working Americans, and those working Americans are going to go to the polls in November. And we, as the Republicans, if we're given the privilege to govern, we're going to turn on American energy. We're going to turn on American innovation, and we're going to, get America back to work.
Yeah, that's what we're all craving for. I want to turn to something that's inside the House of Congress right now. And I think you're uniquely qualified because you entered politics at a very young age. I think you were like 26 or 25 when you won your seat in the Georgia House of Representatives. There's a young congressman from North Carolina that has had a very troubled tenure. Madison Cawthorn. And yes, this week or recently, he just made some new allegations that he's been backpedaling from about cocaine-fueled parties in Congress. Your thoughts on the damage that Madison Cawthorn has done to himself and to the larger Republican Party with making things that he now acknowledges were unsubstantiated?
Yeah, he made extremely serious accusations when he said that he witnessed a member of Congress doing cocaine. That's obviously a felony. It needs to be fully investigated. If the accusation is found to be true, then that member needs to be disciplined. And we have had members found to be doing that before,
Absolutely.
and those people have been expunged from Congress. On the other hand, if it's not true, and as you said, he's going back and forth on it now, then Mr. Cawthorn candidly needs to be disciplined for making a false accusation.
Yeah, it's another thing. And he's really seemed to struggle. I thought Leader McCarthy did more than just a political act yesterday. There seemed to be a little fathering going on there with him, an older politician reminding a young person, just because you're young doesn't mean you violate the rules of Congress or you get crazy. Do you think Kevin McCarthy has handled this well, given the issues that are at hand with Madison Cawthorn?
I think it is in Congressman Cawthorn's court to make a public apology, a public acknowledgement that it was a false statement. And as I said before, if he does not do that, if he maintains it as his true statement, then the accusations that he made need to be fully investigated. And if it's found to be true, the member needs to be disciplined. And if he does not publicly retract his statement and the investigation shows that his accusations were not true, then I think Mr. Cawthorn should be disciplined for making the false accusation. So either way, John, I think there should be a full investigation of what he has said unless he's willing to publicly acknowledge that it wasn't true.
Accountability, something we used to have a lot in Washington. We don't get it that often, but it's clear that's what you're calling for. Accountability one way or the other, whichever way the facts fall.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we need more of that here, and I think people will find what you just said very refreshing. They might not find this as refreshing. It seems as though President Biden is on the cusp of repealing Title 42, which will add to an already extraordinarily overburdened southern border. We had a story the other day that CPB is seeking urgent volunteers to go down and send an army because they're expecting a crush on top of the crush we already have. Your thoughts on the border and what Title 42's repeal might do to it?
Well, first and foremost, I mean, we should. Most Americans want the wall to be built. They understand that we have to have border security. This isn't about being mean. This is about protecting the integrity of the United States borders. And that should have the Biden administration should have never stopped the construction. Under the Trump administration, we had to fight tooth and nail to get it started and to make progress with it. The issue with Title 42 is that if you're seeking asylum because you're being persecuted in your home country, you shouldn't be coming through 3 or 4 or 5 other countries to get to the U.S. to seek it. You should be seeking it in your bordering country, and so it's been abused, and the lifting up of it is going to just make it worse. And it is, again, it's just an indicator of just how out of touch this White House is with where the American citizens are, and how controlled they are by a far left group of people that represents a very, very small minority of this country.
Yeah, that's really, really true. It's really remarkable. And I think I think you've said this many times, and many of your colleagues now use the line, the open border has made every state in the country a border state. Sure. Everybody's feeling the impact in terms of crime and social safety net cost. And yet it seems to be the Democrats' mission to accelerate it, not to slow it down.
Hey, John, let me mention one other thing on that, if I can. Remember, they're dispersing the people throughout the country, and then you've got states like California and New York and other areas where in municipal elections they're allowing non-citizens to vote.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how does that work?
It's a head scratcher, isn't it? Yeah.
That's just not right.
Yeah.
And the fact that the Democrats are allowing this to continue to happen, I think they're going to revolt. I think American citizens are going to revolt against this in the November election, regardless of what party they're in. This isn't about being mean or anything else. This is about protecting the integrity of the United States, the Constitution, and our democracy.
Yeah, and there's history on this. I'm old enough to remember. I was the young reporter at the Associated Press back in 95 and 96 that broke the story about the Clinton-Gore team trying to accelerate naturalizations of immigrants in the country to get as many of them registered to vote and legal to vote in 96. So the Democrats have long seen immigrants as sort of a machinery to getting more people in for voting. And now you see, whether it's San Francisco, New York City, Maryland has several communities that have done it. They want to make non-citizens vote, or at least in local elections. In your state, Secretary of State Raffensperger, there's already a law against it, but he's arguing that you should get a constitutional amendment, ingrain this in the Constitution that only citizens vote in Georgia. What do you think about that? Is that a good move to make it a higher threshold to reverse this somewhere down in the future?
Yeah, that's I would obviously, if I was still in the state legislature, be supportive of that to put in the Constitution. But John, who would have thought that you actually needed a constitutional amendment to say that?
Isn't it amazing?
I wouldn't have thought that it needed to be in there. I will tell you though, Secretary Raffensperger, I'm disappointed in his conduct.
Yep, a lot of people are
during the last election.
Yeah,
and it is. You've heard me say this, Barack Obama got 85,000 absentee ballots in the state of Georgia. Joe Biden got 850,000 absentee ballots in the state of Georgia. The governor's election before the last presidential, I think Stacey Abrams got about 135,000 absentee ballots in the state of Georgia. And so I just don't believe that those numbers could have happened without ballot harvesting.
Yeah.
And it was his responsibility to stop it.
Well, belatedly, there's an investigation, which I guess is good news, but it doesn't, there's no way to go back and fix the 2020 election now. It's over. It's gone. It's done. And that is an extraordinarily lost a moment. I want to ask you about this because in order to make ballot harvesting possible, you had to have mass mailing of ballots and loosen up all of the absentee rules. And while that's going on now, and people are trying to put that toothpaste back in the tube for this next election, Arizona, which kind of went early on to no excuse absentee ballot. Now they want to go back. Like, this hasn't worked. We don't like this. We want to go back to traditional voting. Is there a lesson for the rest of the country in what Arizona is thinking about doing now, abandoning no excuse absentee ballots and trying to go back to the way we should all vote, in person when we can?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with people going in and voting early.
Right.
At the polls
right.
in person with the same driver's license that you or state ID that you have to show to buy Sudafed.
Great point.
But to just be able to mail in the ballots, I mean, you should have to have an excuse. I mean, it can be broad enough that senior citizens, people with disabilities, certainly people in the military that are going to be out of town. I mean, if in-person voting is not reasonably available to somebody, then an absentee ballot should be available for them. But if it's not, they should have to go to the polls to vote.
Yeah. Listen, the rest of democracies around the world have no problem doing it. In fact, they modeled it after us, and now they're scratching their heads like, what's going on with America? It doesn't make any sense. It's right. Pretty remarkable. Last thought, the president just released his defense budget. Obviously, we're in a moment where the world is probably more unstable than we've seen in a long time, and we're not sure where it's going. What did you think of the president's overall budget? And are we putting our money in the right places when you see Russia and China with hypersonic missiles potentially and non-conventional warfare expanding? Do you feel good about the budget, or do you think the president missed his mark on it? Well,
two things I would tell you on that. One is I'm glad that he acknowledged that they have been wrong in their attempts to reduce military spending in the past. I mean, let's not forget that the Democratic Party has been pushing to reduce spending on national security. And now they realize that is not politically popular, and so he's come out with an increase that candidly won't keep pace with inflation. And so, John, a couple of things that I think we need to focus on. We need to look at countries like Georgia and other countries in Europe that want the additional weapon systems, and we need to partner with them in long-term contractual mechanisms and funding mechanisms where we as the American citizens get a better deal for our dollars because they're paying for a lot of the equipment that we would be sending into the European theater. So I very much want to see us expanding the partnerships with countries like Georgia that share our interests, they share our values, and making sure that we get them the weapon systems they need, and they're willing to pay for them.
They are.
And so let's share the cost with our European allies. You've got countries like Germany now that are finally saying, hey, we actually do need to do our 2%, which if you go back, and remember, that's what Trump was pushing for a few years ago, saying everybody, Russia's a threat. We need to be making sure that we're prepared to defend against them. And then we also need to look at things from a partner-centric purchasing system. So if we decide that for the European region, for our NATO area, that we need 10 additional destroyers, for example, and if we decide that the U.S. is going to buy 5 and Germany is going to buy a couple and Britain's going to buy a couple and another country is going to buy 1, then we need to be able to go to the shipbuilders and say, we want to sign a contract for 10 ships and get a better deal than we're currently getting by buying 1 per year, for example. And just like if you go to buy a car, you can, in the old days anyway, you could get a better deal if you were going to buy a fleet of vehicles instead of an individual.
That's right.
We need to find a mutually beneficial contracting arrangement for our NATO partners and other countries that share our interest in our values. And candidly, we can pay less, and the people that are actually selling us the equipment, it cuts their costs to give them a consistent, purchase.
It does.
It can be a win-win-win situation, and that's what I hope as it comes before us, we're able to get more for the U.S. tax dollar.
Yeah, I think everybody's rooting for that. You mentioned President Trump. I just want to ask this question because my interview with him earlier this week got a lot of attention for something else, but he actually talked a little bit about the future of national security in America. And specific, I asked him about China because we're focused on Russia, but China's watching everything and looking how it's going to get its advantage. And I asked him, is there room for a NATO in the Pacific, a PATO, a Pacific Alliance? And he said either that or we extend NATO's mission, but we've got to have a stronger military alliance. We have to build on the Quad, which he started when he was president. Do you think Congress is thinking that way, that we've got to create greater deterrence in the Pacific? You saw China say, we're going to build as many islands as we want in the South Pacific. Is Congress, you think, ready to realize it or to make some sort of alliance in the Pacific that's stronger than what we have right now?
Absolutely. And so you've got countries like Japan, countries like Australia. Australia has fought with us in every single war that we have ever been in, by the way. You've got countries like India that, or continents like India, I should say. We have more people over there that share our interests and our values than are aligned with China. And those are the countries that we need to be focused on. And again, it's another area where we don't have to foot all of the bill as the United States. We need to be partnering with those countries, continents in some cases, that share our interests and our values and have those alliances that, he was talking about. We're stronger together, and we're going to fight by, with, and through our partners. And so let's go ahead and develop the systems and the strategy that revolves around the way we're going to fight.
Yeah, so smart. So much common sense. Congressman, it is always an honor to have you on the show. You always bring lots of news and wisdom, and I want to thank you for your time today.
Hey, thank you, John.
All right, sir. Have a good day.